quiet kids aren't shy, they're hoarding something that no one understands. There is a silent and dangerous belief that the quiet child is absent, detached, or without personality. But psychology shows something surprising: silence is not empty, it is depth. In a noisy world, those who talk less tend to see more. And perhaps what looks like invisibility is actually refined presence. Maybe you are that quiet child in the back of the room, immersed in your own inner life while others vied for attention. While many confused introversion with weakness, you observed patterns, emotions, and details that no one noticed. Silent observation shaped your creativity without you realizing it. But almost no one valued it. Today you will find out what science reveals about this silent leadership that is born away from the spotlight. Let's talk about underestimation, masking, self-validation, and the emotional toll of invisibility. And, above all, how to transform what seemed to be weakness into strategic strength. Because maybe you've never been little, you've just never been understood. The first thing you need to understand is simple, but almost no one teaches it: the quiet child is not absent. It may be in silence, but inside there is an intense, active inner life, pulsating ideas and questions. As the world rumbles, she watches. And this constant observation is anything but empty. Often, the adult interprets silence as disinterest, when in fact it is deep concentration. The quiet child is picking up micro-expressions, tones of voice, subtle changes in the environment. This ability to observe builds emotional intelligence without any applause. But by not imposing herself, she begins to experience invisibility. And here the first risk is born: underestimation. Teachers may feel that she does not participate, classmates may ignore her ideas, and the family may ask her to let go more. Gradually, introversion is seen as a problem to be corrected. But what if what needs adjustment is not the child but the world's gaze? Not all silence is born from the same place. In some cases, the quiet child already demonstrates a natural introversion from an early age, almost as if the inner life were his preferred habitat. She energizes herself, thinks before she speaks, and feels no need to fight for space. This is not social deficiency, it is temperament. But there is another, more delicate scenario. Sometimes, silence appears as a defense in critical environments, where making mistakes is costly or talking too much becomes a reason for reprimand. The child learns that it is safer to observe than to expose himself. And so begins the construction of a social mask, masking, small at first, but increasingly sophisticated. The challenge is to notice the difference. If it's temperament, we need to encourage self-validation and a confident presence. If it is defense, we need to offer welcome and active listening. A simple practice: ask her what she thinks before asking her why she didn't speak. Because silence can be essence. Or it can be survival. There is an almost invisible ability in the quiet child: deep observation. While others speak, she registers patterns, notices subtle changes in emotional climate, and understands social dynamics with astonishing accuracy. It's as if you're always 2 steps behind but mentally 3 steps ahead. This kind of silence is strategic, not empty. Have you ever noticed how some people know exactly when someone is uncomfortable, even without a word being spoken? Often, this sensitivity is born in silent childhood. The active inner life works as a constant emotional laboratory. And this, in the future, can turn into refined empathy and even silent leadership. The problem is that this ability is rarely recognized early. As it does not attract attention, it suffers from underestimation and ends up being confused with excessive shyness. But if well directed, this observation can be trained as a competitive advantage. And the question that remains is, what happens when this perception meets creativity? When there is a rich inner life, something inevitably begins to be born from their creativity. The quiet child spends hours imagining scenarios, creating internal dialogues, inventing worlds that no one sees. Silence becomes fertile ground for original ideas. And often, what looked like isolation was actually construction. Great writers, scientists, and artists were children of intense observation and little exposure. Reading books like Napoleon Hill's Who Thinks Gets Rich can show how deep thinking shapes destinies. Introversion allows ideas to mature before they are presented. And this generates quality, not just quantity. But here a delicate point arises: when invisibility is prolonged, creativity can be stored too much. Unshared ideas do not transform the world. Therefore, encouraging self-validation from an early age is essential. Because creativity in silence is power, but creativity with presence is impact. We live in a culture that rewards speed, performance, and those who speak louder. In this scenario, the quiet child ends up being seen as slow, insecure, or not very engaged. Silence is interpreted as a failure, not as a style. And underestimation begins to creep in almost without realizing it. At school, whoever raises their hand first receives recognition. In the group of friends, those who dominate the conversation gain status. Introversion, on the other hand, is rarely celebrated. Gradually, the child associates discreet presence with social invisibility, as if existing required volume. And here a dangerous internal tension is born. To be accepted, she begins to question her own nature. Do I need to talk more? Is my inner life not enough? When the world values noise, silence starts to feel like a mistake, and that's when the next move happens. At some point, the quiet child begins to hear directly or indirectly that he needs to let go more. Talk more, appear more, perform more. As if love and acceptance were conditioned by the volume of the voice. And silence, which was once natural, now seems inadequate. This pressure undermines self-validation. The implicit message is clear: those who are too discreet run the risk of invisibility. So she tries to adjust her own presence, forcing an extroversion that doesn't always match her inner life. And, without realizing it, she begins to move away from herself. The problem isn't developing new social skills that's healthy. The problem is to believe that you will only be loved if you stop being who you are. When introversion becomes something to be hidden, the social masking is born. And sustaining this mask has a price that sooner or later appears. When the social masking becomes routine, the quiet child learns to play a role. She observes how the most talkative behave and begins to imitate mannerisms, laughter, and even opinions. On the outside, it looks like a successful adaptation. Inside, silence ceases to be rest and becomes tension. This constant effort consumes emotional energy. Introversion, which naturally needs breaks to regain strength, starts to live in a state of alert. The inner life, once a creative refuge, begins to be overloaded. And the feeling of invisibility doesn't go away, it just gets more confusing. The curious thing is that many adults carry this for years without realizing it. They feel extreme social fatigue and do not understand the origin. External underestimation becomes internal self-criticism. And the question begins to arise, albeit quietly: who am I when I'm not performing? There is something painful that almost no one notices. Those who do not demand attention often do not receive it. The quiet child rarely interrupts, rarely complains, rarely disputes space. And so, silence begins to be confused with self-sufficiency. But inside, inner life asks for recognition. Small negligences accumulate. Forgotten invitations, ignored opinions, ideas that go unnoticed until someone taller repeats it. Underestimation becomes routine and invisibility ceases to be circumstantial, it becomes identity. And when that happens, self-validation begins to weaken. the most dangerous thing is that no one sees external drama. There is no screaming, there is no rebellion. Just a smaller and smaller presence. Healthy introversion can, without care, turn into self-effacement. And this is where we need to ask an essential question: silence is being chosen, or prison? Silence can be an inner chapel, a space of reflection where inner life finds clarity and direction. It is there that the quiet child organizes thoughts, processes emotions, and constructs meaning. Observation becomes insight, and introversion becomes a source of wisdom. But the same silence can, little by little, become a prison. When invisibility becomes standard, speaking begins to generate anxiety. Social masking becomes automatic and self-validation weakens. What was once a conscious choice becomes a silent limitation. The difference is in the intent and the context. Silence is strength when there is a solid inner presence. It is prison when it is born from the fear of being seen. And here we enter an even deeper pain: what happens when the world starts to systematically underestimate who you are? Few things hurt as much as realizing that you were ignored while you were talking, or worse, while you were thinking. The quiet child often shares an idea and it goes unnoticed. Minutes later, someone more expansive says something similar and receives recognition. Underestimation begins to hurt in silence. Forgotten invitations, leadership denied, opinions cut off in the middle of the sentence. Invisibility creates a dangerous internal narrative: maybe what I think is not so important. And so, the inner life that was once a creative power begins to retract. Not for lack of capacity, but for lack of external validation. Over time, the child himself starts to anticipate the world and is silent before even trying. Introversion is no longer a style and becomes self-protection. But here comes a possible turnaround: what if that same low-key stance hit a different model of quiet leadership? There's a type of leadership that does not need a stage. The quiet child, with his attentive observation and genuine listening, develops something rare: the ability to understand before reacting. While others compete for attention, she understands the context. And that's the foundation of quiet leadership. Great leaders are not only the ones who speak best, but those who perceive best. The active inner life allows for more thoughtful and less impulsive decisions. Introversion favors strategic reflection. And when there is solid self-validation, silence ceases to be absence and becomes a firm presence. The world may even underestimate this profile at first. But when invisibility is replaced by conscious positioning, the influence grows consistently. The question now is not whether the quiet can lead. It is whether we are ready to reimagine a world that knows how to listen. Perhaps the real problem was never the quiet child. Perhaps the world has not yet learned to listen to the silence. We live in a culture that associates presence with volume, when real presence has more to do with consciousness. And that completely changes the perspective. Reimagining this scenario means teaching adults, educators, and leaders to value observation, inner life, and introversion as legitimate forces. It means asking before concluding, listening before correcting, encouraging self-validation before demanding performance. The quiet doesn't need to be louder, the environment needs to be more attentive. When we stop underestimating, invisibility loses strength. The social masking begins to fall and silent leadership finds space. And perhaps the most powerful revolution is not to turn the quiet into the noisy, but to transform the world into a place that recognizes those who have always been there. Now tell me, how many times have you confused silence with absence? How many times have you underestimated your own inner life because no one applauded? Maybe it's time to exchange invisibility for conscious presence. Not to speak louder, but to position oneself with more truth. And if you started to recognize yourself in this story, how about taking a practical step today? Choose an idea of your own and share it. Ask a question out loud. Exercise self-validation without waiting for external permission. Quiet leadership isn't born out of noise, it's born out of the internal decision not to erase oneself. If this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we transform silence into strength and introversion into strategy. Because maybe you've never been little. Maybe you are just waiting for the world and yourself to learn to listen.